Hey everyone, today I've got a fascinating story that might just shift your perspective on spirituality and faith. It's the journey of Amir Sadiq, a young Muslim whose life took a dramatic turn after a near-death experience where he encountered Jesus. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button and turn on notifications for more amazing stories. So let me introduce myself. I'm Amir Sadiq, currently 28, and I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Cedar Rapids has a vibrant Muslim community, and my family has always been deeply rooted in our Islamic beliefs. From a young age, I was taught that the Quran held all the truth I would ever need, and that Islam was the sole path to salvation. My parents, Zahid and Fatima, instilled in us the importance of following our faith. We prayed 5 times a day, observed Ramadan, and were at the mosque every Friday. This wasn't just a routine, it shaped our identity and was our way of life. Growing up, questioning our faith wasn't just frowned upon, it felt close to impossible. Doubting Islam felt like a betrayal to my family, my religion, and the community that shaped me. I remember as a teenager starting to have some uncertainties. However, each time I brought them up, my dad would look stern and remind me, "Amir, those questions come from Shaitan, forget them." I respected his guidance and did my best not to let those thoughts linger. Then college happened, and wow, things shifted dramatically. Suddenly, I found myself surrounded by a mix of people with all sorts of beliefs and backgrounds. It was a little intimidating at first. It felt like I had stepped out of a black and white movie into a vibrant world of color. That's where I met Lucas Trent, an Orthodox Christian who quickly became a good friend. Initially, I thought my goal was to prove to him that Islam was the only true faith. But Lucas turned out to be quite different from anyone I'd met before. He listened to my perspectives without judgment and responded thoughtfully, all without trying to change my beliefs. Our friendship left me pondering many things I had once taken for granted, and I found myself sneaking glances at the Bible, driven by a curiosity to understand more. I was just an average young guy, Amir Sadiq, trying to navigate life with all its complexities. At the time, I was deep into exploring the Quran. I was on a quest for answers to the swirling questions in my mind. I felt this constant tug of war between my love for my family and community and a growing desire to learn more about the world and my faith. This journey of skepticism and exploration led to an incredible moment that would shift my entire perspective. I experienced something profound, a near-death episode that uprooted every certainty I held dear. But let me rewind a bit and set the scene for you. Picture a typical day, just like any other. I was strolling home after class, my head full of thoughts about passages from the Bible that Zahid had shared with me, alongside verses from the Quran that I was now revisiting with fresh insight. I was so caught up in my reflections that, at first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then it hit me. A sudden, sharp pain pierced my chest, as if a vice were clamping down on my heart. Naturally, I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to fatigue or perhaps a bout of indigestion. But soon, the pain escalated, making it hard for me to breathe, like my lungs were trapped under immense weight. In that moment of panic, I scanned the street, hoping to spot someone who could help. Strangely enough, it was eerily empty. Before I knew it, my legs buckled beneath me, and I crumpled onto the sidewalk. I remember the last view I had, an endless blue sky above, before everything faded to black. Time felt irrelevant as I slipped away. Suddenly, I found myself floating. It's hard to put into words, but it was like I had stepped outside my physical body, looking down at myself lying there, motionless. I noticed people gathering around, someone frantically calling for an ambulance. It felt surreal. The scene played out in slow motion. Next thing I knew, I was in an emergency room, surrounded by doctors and nurses rushing about. Their voices echoed, urgent yet distant, as if I were submerged underwater. I remember glancing over at my own body on the gurney, pale and still, while they struggled to bring me back. That's when I heard a haunting statement from one of the doctors: "We have no pulse." It all began when I found myself in a place that defied explanation, clinically dead, yet my mind felt alive with thoughts I couldn't share. I desperately wanted to shout, to let anyone know that I was still there, observing it all, but no sound escaped me. Then, something remarkable took place. I felt an upward pull, as if I was being drawn away from that hospital room. Everything around me transformed into a dazzling brightness, not harsh or blinding, but rather warm and inviting, like a gentle embrace drawing me closer. As I neared that luminous presence, an unprecedented peace washed over me. All my anxieties about my family, my beliefs, and the uncertainty of tomorrow vanished. It was as if I had finally come home. In that ethereal glow, I noticed him, standing at the heart of that overwhelming light. It was Jesus. Not the historical figure depicted in paintings or books, but a living presence, vibrant and real. His smile radiated a love so profound and accepting that it left me feeling both vulnerable and completely embraced. While he didn't speak in audible words, I understood him perfectly. It was like a warm invitation just for me, Amir, reassured that I was never truly alone and had always been awaited. In that moment, all my doubts about faith and existence shrank to insignificance. Here I stood before love itself, a truth that rendered everything else irrelevant. I longed to linger in that beautiful light forever, basking in his presence. But then I felt a gentle nudge, reminiscent of a parent encouraging a sleeping child to wake up. Jesus seemed to convey that my journey on earth wasn't finished. I had a mission yet to fulfill. Before I could respond, I experienced a sensation akin to falling, plummeting back into my body. The light grew fainter, that serene feeling began to slip away, and in a blink, I was back in the emergency room, gasping and bewildered. The doctor's eyes mirrored my shock, and I could faintly hear someone exclaim, "It's a miracle! He's back!" And it truly was a miracle. I had transitioned from death to life again. More than just a second chance, this experience compelled me to reevaluate everything I believed about God, faith, and my very purpose. In the days that followed my near-death experience, the hospital felt like an alternate reality. I spent a week there, surrounded by a team of doctors who were just as baffled by my revival as I was. They couldn't decipher how my heart had ceased for 5 minutes, and yet here I was, alive and breathing. Lying there in the hospital, I found myself reflecting deeply on what had happened to me. It was surreal, really. The sensation of hovering above my body, the bright, inviting light, and most importantly, the moment I felt the presence of Jesus. Whenever I shut my eyes, his face would appear, and it felt like a piece of that divine light was still tucked away in my heart, bringing warmth and comfort. My family, particularly my father Amir, never left my side. He gripped my hand as if letting go would send me back to that place I had just returned from. My mother Fatima cycled through moments of tears, some from pure joy, and others from silent prayers of gratitude to Allah. They were relieved I was alive, yet there was a visible worry about me, as if they sensed that something profound had shifted within me. I grappled with the intense urge to share my experience, to convey what I had seen and felt with Jesus. But every time I opened my mouth, it felt like the right words slipped through my fingers. How do you explain something so deeply personal and transcendent? Plus, I was apprehensive. What would Amir and Fatima think if they learned their son had met Jesus? So for several days, I remained quiet, letting them believe my silence stemmed from exhaustion or perhaps reflection on the brink of death. Yet internally, I was in turmoil. The beliefs I had held since my childhood suddenly felt fragile. This wasn't merely about choosing one religion over another. It felt like I had touched a truth that transcended structured beliefs. As night enveloped the hospital in stillness, I found solace in prayer. But they weren't the traditional prayers I had always known. Instead, they transformed into heartfelt dialogues with God and Jesus. I often found myself asking why I had been selected for this extraordinary experience and what it was that I was meant to do with this newfound understanding. One night, while I was lost in contemplation, a nurse entered my room. She must have sensed my turmoil because she sat beside me and inquired if I was all right. Before I could hold back, the story spilled out. I told her everything: the blinding light, the encounter with Jesus. Expecting skepticism or ridicule, I was surprised when I saw compassion in her eyes. She took my hand gently and shared that her sister had a near-death experience some years back. "These events change people," she said reassuringly. "Don't rush to comprehend it all, give it time." Her words were a soothing balm to my perplexed heart, and in that moment, I felt understood for the first time since waking. I soon realized I wasn't the only one. Many others had faced similar experiences, having crossed that mysterious line between our world and what lies beyond. In the days that followed, I dove into researching near-death experiences during those quiet moments when I had the chance. I would grab my parents' cell phone, careful to shield the screen whenever someone walked in, and read all these deeply moving accounts from people of diverse backgrounds. They spoke of familiar things: bright lights, profound peace, encounters with spiritual beings. These themes echoed my own experience, and with each story, my belief grew stronger that what I had gone through was indeed real. It wasn't just some wild dream or a hallucination triggered by low oxygen levels, like some skeptics claimed. No, what I witnessed felt like a genuine glimpse into the divine. With that certainty, however, came a weighty responsibility. This extraordinary insight into the afterlife must have come with a purpose. I couldn't just slip back into my old routine as if nothing had changed. Something profound had happened to me, and I was determined to navigate my new reality. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, I understood that I was walking out not just as someone who had survived a heart attack, but as a person who had truly transformed, someone who had died and was now reborn. The world appeared different. Colors seemed more vibrant, sounds clearer. It felt like I was seeing everything anew, as if in full Technicolor for the first time. I knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Questions from my family and expectations from my community would loom large, but I took comfort in the fact that I wasn't alone on this journey. The light and love I had encountered in the presence of Jesus stayed with me, guiding me forward. So with that reassurance tucked firmly in my heart, I took my first steps into this new chapter of life. Returning to my home in Cedar Rapids felt both familiar and surreal. The walls, the furniture, the photographs, everything was just as I had left it, but I was different. The old Amir Sadiq who had walked out weeks ago was gone. At first, my parents were simply relieved to have me back. They seemed oblivious to the subtle shifts in my behavior, or perhaps they chose to chalk it up to the trauma I had endured. My mother, Fatima, would whip up my favorite dinners, and Lucas, my dad, would sit beside me for hours, sometimes in silence, other times sharing nostalgic tales from my childhood. However, as the days passed, it became harder to ignore the new version of me. Confusion and guilt swirled within me like a storm. I often found myself gazing at the prayer rug in the corner of my room, the familiar ritual of 5 daily prayers now feeling foreign. It wasn't that I didn't want to pray anymore. It was just that my understanding of what prayer meant had shifted dramatically. One day, while sitting in the garden, my dad came to join me. He paused for a moment, his gaze heavy with concern before finally speaking. "Amir," he said, his voice thick with worry, "what's going on with you? You've stopped attending the mosque and your prayers." I had been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come, yet I felt unprepared for how to explain everything to him. How could I convey feelings I barely grasped myself? Taking a deep breath, I began to share my experience. I talked about the light, the overwhelming sense of peace I'd felt, and the figure of Jesus. My words tumbled out in a mess, and I could see my father's face transform from worry to astonishment, then to a kind of fear. When I finally finished, silence enveloped us. He stared at the floor, gripping his hands tightly. "Oh, may Allah protect us," he murmured, his voice barely audible. There were tears shimmering in his eyes. "Amir, my son, you've been led astray by Shaitan. These visions, they can't be real." I had anticipated his reaction, but it still hurt deeply. "Dad, I know it's difficult," I replied, my voice trembling, "but I lived through it. It felt more real than anything ever." He stood up sharply, shaking his head. "I don't want to hear any more of this. Let's call Imam Hassan. He'll know what to do." In the days that followed, our home felt like a silent battlefield. My mother cried quietly when she thought no one was watching, and my father kept making phone calls to community leaders, his voice low and tense. I felt increasingly like an outsider. When Imam Hassan visited, I hoped for some solace. He was a man I had always admired for his wisdom and kindness, but when he insisted that my experiences were mere illusions and temptations, I realized that a chasm had grown between us that couldn't be bridged by words. During this tumultuous time, I found comfort in my friendship with Lucas. He was someone I could talk to openly, about everything that had happened. Even though he followed Christianity, he never pressured me or tried to convert me. He simply listened, offering support and insights that helped me process my feelings. One night, while we were talking on campus, I felt a sense of connection I desperately needed. Lucas shared something with me that really resonated. Amir sometimes says that life can take unexpected turns to reveal something more meaningful. It's not just about changing beliefs, it's about enhancing our bond with the divine. His insights opened my eyes to a new way of thinking. I realized that exploring different perspectives didn't mean I was turning my back on my roots or upbringing. Instead, I was broadening my understanding of spirituality. But here's the kicker. How do I help my family and my community grasp this shift? At home, things became increasingly tense. I could feel the heavy stares from neighbors as I walked past them. The whispers at the mosque stung. Those who had watched me grow up now regarded me like I was a stranger. One evening, after a particularly intense argument with my father, I felt the need to clear my mind. I strolled through the familiar streets of Cedar Rapids. That night, it hit me. I stood at a crossroads. I faced a choice. I could bury my experiences, retreat into my past for the sake of everyone's happiness, or I could embrace my new truth, even if it risked pushing my loved ones away. The decision weighed heavily on my heart, yet I knew deep down which way to go. I couldn't ignore what I had seen or the feelings I had experienced. Returning home, I resolved to be open about my journey, no matter the fallout. My love for my family and community was strong, but I understood that I must honor the truth that I had come to know. I anticipated that the road ahead would be tough. Still, I felt comforted by the light and love surrounding me. With that assurance, I prepared myself for whatever challenges lay ahead. The moment I decided to speak truthfully about my near-death experience and my encounter with Jesus, I knew consequences would follow. Still, I was bracing myself for it. Then came that fateful Friday. Family gathered for prayer, followed by our usual meal, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. My father barely touched his plate, while my mother sat unusually quiet. I realized I could no longer delay my conversation. After we finished eating, I took a deep breath, summoned all my courage, and said, "Dad, Mom, we need to discuss what happened to me in the hospital, what I saw." Before I could finish, my father raised his hand, silencing me with a shaky voice. "Amir," he said, grappling with his emotions, "think carefully about what you're about to say. Consider your family, consider your community." I inhaled deeply, knowing that respect for them compelled me to be truthful. "It's exactly because I care about you that I must be honest. What I experienced was genuine. I met Jesus. I felt his love." Everything changed for me in an instant. An outburst from my father shattered the relative calm of our home. His voice boomed with accusations, claiming I had been misled and had turned my back on my faith and our family. Meanwhile, my mother sat there, tears trickling down her cheeks onto the table. I desperately tried to clarify my feelings, explaining that I wasn't dismissing Islam. I was merely trying to share an experience that had deepened my understanding of God. But it felt like no one was truly listening. The conversation spiraled into a heated argument that lasted well into the night. At one point, my father's words struck me like a blow. "If you keep this up, Amir, you won't have a home here anymore." That statement hit hard. I had anticipated some friction from my revelation, but never did I think it would escalate to this level. I glanced over at my mother, searching for her support, but she turned away, unable to bear the tension. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, replaying the painful exchange in my head. Was I wrong for sharing what I felt? Each time doubt crept in, I thought back to the warmth and love I experienced when I encountered Jesus, and I realized I couldn't just ignore that feeling. The next day brought with it a chill in the air that mirrored the atmosphere at home. My father wouldn't even look at me, and my mother avoided my gaze, leaving me in a suffocating silence. I spent the day in my room, trying to make sense of the turmoil around me. Just then, a message popped up on my phone from Lucas, checking in on me. Feeling I could no longer withstand the oppressive quiet, I decided to meet him. We convened at a cozy cafe close to the campus. The moment Daniel saw me, he sensed that something was off. I unleashed everything that had transpired, and he listened quietly, offering comfort. "Amir," he said when I finished, "what you're facing is incredibly tough, but remember, you don't have to go through this alone." His encouraging words bolstered my spirit, yet reminded me of the magnitude of the situation. I was on the verge of losing my family, my community, everything I held dear. As the days wore on, conditions at home became increasingly strained. My father refused to address me directly, opting to communicate through my mother instead. I overheard hushed talks about consulting a religious leader to rid me of what they perceived as evil influences. The thought that my meaningful experience could be interpreted as malevolent truly saddened me. Before long, word began to circulate in our community, and those I had known since childhood now regarded me with both wariness and pity. Some attempted to steer me back to what they deemed the right path, while others chose to distance themselves. The isolation was suffocating. Just a week after that intense Friday talk, my dad called me. When I saw him, his face looked worn and older. He took a deep breath and said, "I've given you time to think it over. Are you ready to acknowledge your mistake and come back to the right way?" Looking into the eyes of the man who had always been my hero, I felt a rush of heartbreak. "Dad," I replied, "I love you. I love our family, and I care about our community. But I can't ignore what I've experienced and the truth that I've found." He shut his eyes, as though my words caused him real pain. When he opened them again, a chill I had never witnessed before washed over me. "So you've made your decision," he said, his tone sharp. "I can't have someone who turns away from our faith living here. You have until tomorrow to leave." I expected those words, yet they struck me like lightning. My mom, who had been standing in the doorway, gasped and ran away, tears in her eyes. I wanted to chase after her and provide comfort, but deep down I knew it wouldn't change anything. That night, as I gathered my things, the reality settled in like a heavy fog. I was saying goodbye to my family, my home, everything I had ever known. Fear and doubt clawed at me, threatening to drown me in despair. But then, amidst my turmoil, I felt a peace wash over me, reminiscent of what I had experienced in my near-death moment. A quiet reassurance seemed to whisper, "I am with you." The next morning, with only a small backpack filled with a few clothes and personal items, I stepped out of the house where I had grown up. My mother hugged me tightly at the door, murmuring, "May Allah guide you back to us." My father just stood by the window, a mask of disappointment etched on his face. As I walked away, the backpack felt heavy on my back, but the weight of loss pressed down even harder on my heart. I realized right then that my life was about to change forever. The cost of seeking the truth was staggering, more than I had ever anticipated. Yet, despite the pain, a strong conviction settled in me. I was on the right path. A challenging journey was starting, but I knew I wasn't alone. The light I had seen and the love I had felt were still with me. With that belief, I took my first steps into an uncertain future, filled with potential. Leaving my childhood home was undoubtedly the toughest moment I had ever faced. On that first day, I roamed the streets of Cedar Rapids. Places that once felt comforting now appeared foreign and intimidating. It was Lucas who... The moment I reached out to Amir Sadiq, I was beyond grateful for his quick response. Without a second thought, he said, "My couch is available for you, however long you need." That kind gesture really touched me. Those initial days at Amir's house were a real roller coaster. There were times when the relief washed over me, a sense of freedom from hiding my true self and what I had gone through. But then, just when I thought I had things figured out, waves of sadness and uncertainty would crash in. I often found myself staring at my phone, hoping desperately that my parents would call me and say it was all just a misunderstanding. Yet the silence from the other end was deafening. Amir and his family were nothing short of amazing. They didn't try to change me or impose their beliefs. Instead, they created a safe haven for me to just be myself and come to terms with everything happening around me. Amir's mom, a lovely woman named Fatima, often noticed me awake during the wee hours and would sit beside me, sometimes quietly, sometimes sharing comforting words. One night, she shared something that resonated deeply. "Amir, sometimes God leads us down challenging paths to prepare us for something greater." Those words shifted my perspective entirely. I started to view my struggles not merely as losses, but as chances to reconnect with my faith on my terms, away from the rigid expectations I had known before. However, reality hit hard soon after. I realized I needed to find a job and a permanent place to stay. Thankfully, college wasn't an immediate concern due to my scholarship, but it didn't take long for the financial pressure to kick in. I dove into the job hunt, but it proved to be quite challenging. Cedar Rapids is a tight-knit community, and rumors traveled fast. Many places that would have welcomed me before suddenly felt hostile. I could feel the glances and hear the murmurs behind my back. "It's that guy Sadiq, the one with that strange vision." Luck smiled upon me when I finally landed a job at a far-off bookstore. The owner, an older gentleman named Mr. Johnson, didn't know or care about my past. "If you can handle books and count cash, you're in," he told me. The bookstore quickly became my sanctuary. Surrounded by volumes on every faith and philosophy, I spent my spare time diving into ideas I'd once been told were taboo. It wasn't long before I discovered that my near-death experience wasn't an isolated incident. There were numerous accounts from various cultures and faiths that mirrored my own. I remember the moment I decided to start keeping a diary. It wasn't meant for anyone else to read, it was just for me. Writing became a way to untangle my thoughts and emotions. I poured out my feelings about losing my family and the tight-knit community I had known. There was pain, a lot of it, but as I wrote, I found it a bit easier to piece everything together. Suddenly, I discovered a thread running through my journey, the relentless quest for truth and the unconditional love that I had felt in those fleeting moments that seemed to reach beyond this life. As time passed, I began to connect with new people. Aside from Lucas and his family, I found others who had faced similar struggles. Some were former Muslims like me, others came from entirely different faith backgrounds. What brought us together was our shared desire to seek a deeper understanding of the divine, unfettered by the walls of organized religion. Among these new friends was Mia, a former Catholic who had survived a near-death experience after a car crash. She introduced me to a support group for those who had gone through similar life-altering moments. Attending those meetings was like a breath of fresh air. For the first time since my own experience, I felt truly seen and understood. But of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were dark days when the absence of my family hit me like a ton of bricks. Sometimes, as I walked past our old home, I'd find myself longing to see my mother tending to her garden or my father washing his car. Those moments made me question if I could bear the weight of my choices. It was during one particularly tough night that I had a vivid dream. Suddenly, I was back in that radiant light from my near-death experience, with Jesus standing there, a warm smile on his face. He didn't say a word, he just wrapped his arms around me. When I woke, tears streaked my cheeks, but my heart felt lighter. That dream reminded me why I had chosen this difficult path. About 6 months after I left my parents' house, I found a small apartment to rent. It wasn't much, but it was a space I could call my own. On the day I moved in, as I took in the bare walls and empty rooms, pride and sadness washed over me. I had stitched my life back together, albeit at a great cost. That evening, sitting amidst the unpacked boxes on the floor, I opened my journal and wrote, "The journey continues. I'm uncertain of where it will lead me, but I know I'm not alone. The light I witnessed and the love I felt will always be with me, and that is enough." The road to rebuilding my life was just beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. As I settled into life in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a sense of calm washed over me. Admittedly, the road ahead was far from straightforward, with numerous hurdles yet to overcome and relationships to rebuild. But for the first time in ages, I felt content with the choices I was making. This wasn't the journey I had imagined, nor would I label it the easiest one. Nonetheless, it belonged to me, and I was wholly committed to following where it led. Then something surprising began to unfold. My story, a tale of a young Muslim guy who nearly lost everything and had a profound encounter with Jesus, started to reach a wider audience. It all sparked quite innocently during one of the support group gatherings for NY. I shared my experience there, and it caught the attention of a freelance journalist named Rebecca. She was genuinely fascinated and asked if she could write an article about me for a local blog. To be honest, I had my reservations. I was already navigating through so much pain, and the thought of putting my story out there felt overwhelmingly daunting. But deep down, a small voice encouraged me. It might just help someone else grappling with their beliefs. So, I took a leap of faith and said yes. A few weeks later, when Rebecca's piece hit the internet, I was taken aback by the responses. People from all over the country reached out to me via social media. There were skeptics who raised eyebrows at my claims, others who wanted to dive deeper into my experience, and many who saw themselves in my struggles with faith and identity. One message stood out more than the rest. It was from a young man named Ahmed who lived not far away. He wrote, "Your story has inspired me to question my own beliefs. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm walking this path alone." Reading that struck a chord in me. It hit me that my journey was bigger than just my individual experience. It had the power to spark discussions about faith, spirituality, and reality that transcended conventional religious norms. Soon enough, invitations began pouring in for me to speak at various gatherings and small events. Initially, I felt like an imposter. Who was I to talk about such profound topics? I lacked the credentials of a religious figure or a scholarly voice. I was just a guy who had gone through something extraordinary and was still figuring it all out. Yet when I began to share my story, I discovered the value of what I was offering. People weren't looking for rigid answers or dogmatic theories. They wanted to hear a genuine experience, and that's exactly what I provided. I found myself reflecting on my journey recently, full of doubts, challenges, and enlightening moments. One day, an opportunity arose that I hadn't expected. I was asked to speak at an interfaith gathering held at the local university. The auditorium was bustling with people from various faiths, including a number of Muslims, and I noticed some familiar faces from my past community. As I stepped onto the stage, my heart raced, and I could feel the weight of anticipation in the room. At first, my voice trembled, but as I started to recount my near-death experience in meeting Jesus, a sense of peace enveloped me. I made it clear that I wasn't there to convert anyone or claim that one faith was superior to another. Instead, I wanted to share my personal journey and suggest that maybe there's more to spiritual understanding than what traditional religious teachings offer. Once I finished speaking, a hush fell over the audience before questions poured in. Some inquiries were pointed and accusatory, suggesting I had abandoned my faith, while others reflected genuine curiosity, eager to delve deeper into my story. Among the crowd, a wise, older Muslim woman caught my attention. She stood up and shared how her grandson had a similar experience after an accident, expressing regret for keeping his story silent for fear of community backlash. Her heartfelt words struck a chord with me, reinforcing that my story was not just mine alone. It could create a space for others to share their own experiences as well. I realized I was challenging the silence around spiritual experiences that often don't align with conventional narratives. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. The moment my story gained traction, I began receiving alarming threats online from radical extremists. They labeled me as a danger to Islam, some claiming I was a Westerner trying to sabotage the faith, and others suggesting I was under demonic influence. The fear those messages instilled in me nearly pushed me to withdraw and return to a quiet, unremarkable life. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of those who found solace in my words and the meaningful discussions my story had sparked. Then came a phone call that took me by surprise. It was my mother. She had learned about my speech at the university, and her voice trembled as she said, "Amir, I can't wrap my head around what you've experienced. I still pray for Allah to guide you back, but I admire your bravery." In that fleeting moment of connection, my heart soared. It was a little sign that perhaps there was hope for mending the bridges that had seemed irreparably damaged. As I continued to share my narrative, invitations to speak at different events started to roll in. I made it a point to join radio shows and podcasts as often as I could. It wasn't for the sake of notoriety or the spotlight. Rather, I felt it was vital to engage in tough talks surrounding faith, spirituality, and our understanding of reality. During one of these discussions, the host posed a thought-provoking question. "Amir, after all that you've been through, how do you view your faith now?" I paused to collect my thoughts. I would say my faith is less about certainty and more akin to an ongoing journey, I replied. It's really about embracing the vastness of the divine. I've come to understand that no single religion claims absolute truth. For me, it revolves around love, compassion, and a continuous pursuit of a deeper relationship with the divine, whatever name we use to refer to it. As those words left my lips, a wave of tranquility washed over me. My near-death experience, despite the hardships and losses, had gifted me a profound freedom, an opportunity to explore spirituality outside the boundaries of established religions. Even more fulfilling was my ability to assist others in this exploration. The unfolding of my narrative took turns I couldn't have anticipated. While it was often overwhelming and at times intimidating, it proved to be a deeply significant journey, one for which I felt immense gratitude. As my story gained traction, and I became more engaged in conversations about spirituality and near-death experiences, I realized that I needed to enhance my own comprehension of these subjects. Just recounting my tale was insufficient. I found myself compelled to dive deeper and situate my experiences within a broader spectrum of spiritual and scientific insights. I began to devour an array of literature on near-death experiences, consciousness, quantum physics, and comparative religion. The hours I spent at the university library exploring both academic and philosophical writings were eye-opening. The more I absorbed, the clearer it became how intricate and expansive the realm of spiritual experiences and human consciousness truly is. A standout book for me was Life After Life by Dr. Raymond Moody. His exploration of near-death experiences revealed to me that while my journey was uniquely mine, it also resonated with common threads seen in countless stories from around the globe. This revelation prompted me to ponder. If so many individuals across diverse cultures and faiths share similar encounters, what does that signify about reality and consciousness? I was particularly captivated by the parallels between near-death experiences and mystical moments prevalent in various spiritual traditions. The descriptions of divine light, unconditional love, and an overwhelming sense of unity echoed throughout time and across different cultures, striking a familiar chord in my own personal experience. I've come to see my journey not as something solitary, but as part of a bigger tapestry of human experience. This realization sparked my curiosity, guiding me to various conferences and workshops focused on consciousness and spirituality. It was at one of these gatherings that I encountered Dr. Anna Peterson, a trailblazer in understanding death and the dying process. Her insights about near-death experiences and their potential to reshape our lives hit home for me. After her presentation, I had a chance to have a quick chat with her. When I shared a bit of my own story, she looked at me with such warmth and enthusiasm. "Amir," she said, "you've received a valuable gift. Use it wisely, not to validate yourself or contradict others, but to shine more light and foster understanding in the world." Her words resonated deeply, molding my perspective on my purpose. It wasn't about converting skeptics or proving the authenticity of what I'd been through. Rather, it was about facilitating dialogue and encouraging a wider understanding of spirituality. But my quest for knowledge didn't just stop at the spiritual. I found myself drawn to the intersection of science and spirituality. The study of altered states of consciousness, how meditation affects the brain, and even theories in quantum physics that probe the true nature of our reality. One day, while tuning into an online lecture on neuroscience and mystical experiences, I had a sort of revelation. The lecturer discussed how certain spiritual experiences could be reproduced in a lab setting using brain stimulation. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. Could it be that what I had experienced was merely a neurological event, lacking any true spiritual essence? However, then a fresh perspective emerged. Perhaps neuroscience wasn't negating spiritual reality, but rather revealing the pathways through which we could connect to it. Just as a radio doesn't create music but simply channels it, maybe our brains are the instruments that allow us to access broader spiritual dimensions. This thought encouraged me to delve into various meditative traditions. I began to meditate every day, alternating between Islamic Sufi techniques, Buddhist mindfulness, and Christian contemplation. Each practice offered a unique lens on the same spiritual reality I had glimpsed during my near-death experience. Then, During a deep meditation one day, I had a moment that brought me back to that experience. I felt that light, that profound love wash over me. It wasn't as intense as what I had encountered before, but it was a powerful reminder of that sacred connection. Reflecting on my experiences, I realized that my near-death experience was merely the beginning of a much broader adventure. This journey wasn't just about what lies beyond. It also revolved around understanding reality, consciousness, and the essence of being human. Every day, I find myself learning a bit more, whether from new books, the meditations I engage in, or the conversations I have with others. It's funny how the more I delve into knowledge, the more I uncover how little I truly know. This realization has taught me a crucial lesson. Wisdom lies in acknowledging the gaps in our understanding. Each question I pose leads to new mysteries, and perhaps that's the true purpose of our quest, not to land on a final answer, but to keep exploring and marveling at the vast unknown. Throughout this journey, I've found that knowledge and spirituality can exist hand in hand. Some friends I've made in the realm of near-death experiences and alternative spirituality have voiced concerns, thinking I might be overthinking things or trying to bring science into what should remain sacred. Honestly, I believe that understanding the brain and consciousness only adds depth to the spiritual experience, rather than dimming its brilliance. As I've continued my exploration, I couldn't shake the feeling that there are still significant challenges ahead. My quest for understanding often collides with the teachings I grew up with, causing friction with both my longtime community and some newfound friends. Some claim I've become too intellectual. They say I'm overanalyzing what should be accepted on faith. Yet I can't help but think of the words from the Sufi poet Rumi, "While the lamps may differ, the light they give is fundamentally the same." In my search for deeper knowledge, I have begun to question the divisions that exist between religions. It dawned on me that these separations often stem more from historical and political influences than from actual spiritual disparities. It's clear to me now that this expansion of perspective, although enlightening, has come with its own set of challenges. One night, as I reflected on my path, I opened my journal and jotted down my thoughts. The pursuit of answers has shown me that the biggest truths often lie not in the answers we chase, but in the questions we ask. Embracing that humility and openness allows us to connect with a more profound wisdom. As I progress on this journey of spiritual growth and personal discovery, I know it's just the start of something even greater ahead. Even though some time had passed, the ache of being apart from my family never truly faded away. There were moments when a familiar laugh or the aroma of my mother's cooking would hit me hard. It was like a knot in my throat that just wouldn't go away. It was after giving a talk at my university that I got a call from her. That quick conversation sparked a flicker of hope in me. Perhaps, after a while, we could mend our relationship. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. I decided to reach out more often and began sending my mother emails. I kept them simple at first, just sharing snippets of my life, how college was treating me and my job at the bookstore. I intentionally left out the spiritual journey I had embarked on and the talks I was giving. My aim was to slowly rebuild our bond, without applying too much pressure. To my delight, she replied. Her responses started off short, sometimes just a line, but they gradually became more detailed. She filled me in about our family and what was happening in the neighborhood. I never brought up my dad directly, but I would drop in comments like how proud he would be of my grades. Then, about 3 years after I had moved out, I received an email that brought tears to my eyes. It was from my mother, and she addressed me as Amir. She acknowledged our differences but assured me that no matter what, I would always be her son, and she would always love me. Those words felt like a healing balm for all the wounds I had been carrying. I quickly replied, pouring out my love for her and expressing how much I wanted to see her again. To my surprise, she agreed to meet. We chose a cafe that was a safe distance from our old neighborhood for our first meeting. When I spotted her walking in, my heart raced. She looked older and more worn down than I remembered. We embraced tightly, a wordless gesture that spoke volumes. Initially, the atmosphere was tense, filled with awkward silences and surface-level chit-chat, But as time went on, we began to delve into deeper topics. She opened up about how hard it had been for her when I left, sharing how she cried herself to sleep for weeks. "I don't fully comprehend it," she said, "but I've come to realize that maybe I don't need to understand everything to love you." Her honesty struck a chord within me. I reflected on my own journey for truth and understanding, and I wondered if I had been too rigid myself. Perhaps love and acceptance mattered more than always being in agreement. From that moment on, our meetings became regular, each one bringing us closer to healing. In Cedar Rapids, Iowa, my journey with my family has been quite the roller coaster. At first, my dad was pretty reserved. For 2 whole years after reconnecting with my mom, he wouldn't even meet with me. Meanwhile, my mom was quietly working her magic, trying to mend his heart. Then one day, on Eid al-Fitr, the celebration marking the end of Ramadan, I got a message from him. It was brief and kind of stiff, but it invited me for dinner. I can't describe how my heart skipped a beat, hands trembling as I typed my acceptance. Walking back into my childhood home after all that time was like stepping into a dream where everything felt both familiar and distant. When I saw my father in the living room, he stood there, rigid and formal. Our greeting was a handshake that felt more like a formality than a welcome. The dinner was a mixed bag of feelings. There were awkward silences and moments where old family dynamics peeked through. My mom worked hard to keep the conversation light, chatting about the weather and neighborhood updates. As the evening drew to a close, my father finally broached the sensitive topic that had been hanging over us. "Amir," he began, his voice strained with emotion, "I still struggle to understand your choices. I pray that Allah guides you back to the right path. But you are my son, and I believe we've wasted enough time." His words weren't a full blessing, but they were more than I dared hope for, a small opening for future conversations. Moving forward, I poured my energy into restoring my family ties. It wasn't a walk in the park. We had our fair share of heated arguments and frustration on both sides. But amidst those tough times, there were also moments filled with laughter and shared memories. Little by little, I began to receive invites to family get-togethers again. Relatives who once kept their distance started to approach me, some with skepticism, but others curious about my experiences. One day, during a family reunion, my young cousin Zahid quietly pulled me aside. "Amir," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice, "I have doubts about our faith too, but I'm scared to speak up. How did you find the courage?" His question struck a chord with me, a reminder of just how vital it is to keep these lines of communication open, not to push anyone to change their beliefs, but to create a safe space for exploring doubts. As time went on, I learned that reconciliation is not just a destination. It's a journey we all navigate together. Years after reuniting with my father, we had a conversation that left a lasting impression on me. He shared his thoughts on faith, saying, "Amir, I genuinely believe in the truth of Islam, but I can see how your path has changed you. You've become someone who is caring and thoughtful. Maybe Allah has a bigger plan that we can't fully grasp right now." Hearing those words was significant. They reflected the growth we had experienced as individuals and as family. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a recognition of the worth of my journey. Reconnecting with my family and community has been a continuous journey, with its share of tough days filled with misunderstandings and frustration. Still, there's a profound sense of gratitude for this second chance. Throughout this experience, I've learned that genuine love goes beyond differing beliefs and viewpoints. At times, the bravest act we can undertake is to reach out across our differences and say, "I may not fully understand you, but I care for and respect you." This path of healing has taught me that true spirituality isn't about dividing us. It's about deepening our connections in significant ways. For this insight, I will always be thankful.